Welcome back to the Wealth and Wisdom podcast. Today's a very special episode for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's episode number 50, which is a huge milestone for me. I've been blown away by the number of people downloading the episodes each week, the number of people who are sharing the podcast, but above all, the positive feedback I've been getting from everyone. It's absolutely humbling, just to say the least. Secondly, I've found myself in an unusual position as a guest again, not the host. Ali Flynn's the host, and the podcast is The Challenges That Change Us. Now, this episode is unlike any we've done before. This episode is a deeply personal journey that I'm more than a little bit nervous about sharing with you. We're going to talk about a topic that is deeply personal to me, male fertility and the painful roller coaster of a journey I went on towards parenthood. But as they say, every cloud has a silver lining. We'll discuss the journey I went on and how it also led to the most incredible blessing in my life, the birth of my beloved daughter, Sophie. I must admit that the decision to share such an intimate part of my life was not an easy one, and this episode has actually been recorded and waiting to be released for over 6 months now. I've always been the one that's guiding the conversation, making others feel comfortable enough to open up, and now it's my turn to step into the spotlight and reveal my own vulnerability. I truly hope that by revealing my own struggles and ultimately the triumph, it may resonate with some of you and offer a glimmer of hope for those going through a similar experience. So as I take this bit of a leap of faith, I want to express my deepest thanks to each and every one of you who's been part of the podcast. So whether you're a listener, a guest, and especially those who have been actively sharing the podcast. So without further delay, I'll hand over to Ali.
Hello and welcome to Challenges That Change Us, the podcast where we talk to our guests about how their challenges have impacted them today and how they overcame them. Whether you are someone that feels like you are thriving right now, trudging through the mud, or somewhere in between, this podcast is designed to give you practical advice, profound insight into your own experience, and inspire you to embrace your life. My name is Ali Flynn, the co-founder and CEO of Try Altitude Performance, and I will be your host. It's time to buckle up your seatbelts and let's get this ball rolling. Welcome, Ben, to Challenges That Change Us. I'm so excited to have you on here today.
Yeah, welcome. Welcome is what I'm saying. It's usually me in the interviewing chair. So yeah, thanks very much for having me here.
And Ben, usually we start with the animal question, but I was thinking then it's because originally when I spoke to you, I was going to get you on as an expert, and then we started chatting. I was like, so how do you feel about actually telling your personal story? Because so we're going to have to get you back as an expert in the financial space, but today we're actually going to be going down a completely different track and talking about something that's a little closer to your heart today. So thank you for giving us that opportunity for coming on.
My pleasure. And it is rather weird being in the other side of the table, so to speak.
And Ben, I love to start every interview with asking the guests what animal best describes them and what is it about that animal?
So I thought about this a lot when you told me I needed to be prepared for this. And I think the best animal to describe me, I wish it was an owl, nice and wise, full of plenty of wisdom. But I think a better description of me would probably be a border collie dog.
Yeah. What is it about a border collie?
Well, I thought about it a lot. I've got a very, I suppose you'd say, a brain that goes very quickly. I like to work hard. I like to do a lot. I'm always looking for some other opportunities. I'm always chasing things down and I can never sort of sit still. So, yeah, I own 2 border collies myself and they definitely resonate with me.
It's funny you should say that because Sam is our editor. So big shout out to the guy behind the scenes, Sam, the podcast butler, who does all of our work. But he said to me, Als, you've got to meet Ben because he is such a hard worker. That was his description. He's like, he works so hard. He reminds me so much. You guys remind me so much of each other. And then we got on and started chatting. And I think it was like 2 hours later, we're like, okay, let's just book in a podcast.
Yeah, I think that's true. And unfortunately, when you get 2 people in a room that really, really energize, it's like having 2 border collies stuck in in a small backyard.
Yes. And so, Ben, let's start with, because I still don't know a lot about your background, maybe if you could tell us a little bit about where you've come from and what's kind of shaped your career to date.
So, Ali, I've come from the land. I grew up on a cattle property in northwest New South Wales, a little town called Corindai, which is about an hour south of Tamworth. And with my family, it's I think my dad's the third generation on the farm. I would have been the fourth. I went off to university like you, and I went to Armidale and studied an agricultural economics degree. And after doing that for 4 years, didn't really know what I wanted to do and fell into banking for a while. Hated that, Ali. It just wasn't suited to me in any way, shape or form. So I did that for a while. And then I fell into financial advice, and I ended up spending just on 20 years in financial advice, working predominantly with business owners and farmers and graziers. Now, I did that for sort of 4 years after uni, and then I headed to London, and which was a hell of a shock for me. I went from, growing up on the farm, going to college in Armidale, and then doing a little bit of work, and then ended up right in the middle of London working for a hedge fund. And we were managing, or I was part of a team that was managing $37 billion at that stage. That was about 2003, 2004, which was a whole lot of fun. I essentially went over there and travelled for a year and tried to work as much as I could to earn as much as I could to then go travelling. And then my dad got sick, helped him out on the farm for a while, and then went back into financial advice and did that for I think that's another probably 16 years. And I worked for a number of people, Ali, and eventually, I think it was 12 years ago now, I started my own financial advice practice. And then just to sort of tie it off, there was a little bit of adversity there. I had a suspected heart attack in 2020. Luckily, it wasn't a heart attack. It was just a heart scare. And I have a 6-year-old daughter, which we'll go into today. Oh, she's 6 now, but at the time she was 4. And I came home after the suspected heart attack, spending 24 hours in intensive care with cardiologists, etc. And I looked at my daughter and I thought, you know what? She's not seeing the best of me or all of me. And I got back on the horse a little bit after a couple of days. I sort of settled myself down and thought, you know what? I've just got to get healthy, lower the stress levels and get on with things, because I can tolerate a high level of stress, and I thought my body could, but it can't. Not as high as I thought. And I went from the absolute pinnacle of my career. I was at my absolute peak. We had a highly successful business. We were winning awards. We had more clients than we could poke a stick at, to actually making the choice to walk away from that and do something else. And I took 12 months off and said, I don't know what I'm going to do now after I'd sold my practice. Sort of had a bit of what I call a trial retirement, Ali. And then after about 3 days, I was bored. But I promised my wife I would take a year, and I took a year. And then I think it was about a month off a year, and I came home and said, I'm going to start a podcast. And she just looked at me and laughed and said, well, I'm not starting it with you. Good luck. And that was about just a little over a year ago now. We got the podcast up and running. I now do strategic coaching for farming families. And yeah, I'm living a great life.
You know, we had this discussion at the start as to what adversity that we should be talking about. And what you've just spoken about there is huge. And what so many women and men struggle with is when they're in a role and they could absolutely love it or they could not like it, but they know that they're running on high, right? They're using every bit of energy they have, every spare moment. They might be brilliant in the space, but at what cost? And so having to weigh that up and having the courage to walk away and start something new is massive, especially when, you know, I don't know if this was your experience, but your identity's wrapped around that. People know you as that. You make really good income. You're providing for the family. And, you know, we did discuss at depth whether we should talk about that specific thing, because I think our audience would love to hear about that. But we're actually going to go into something different today. Like we've mentioned already, we did bring you on to talk about something a little closer to your heart. And you mentioned earlier that your daughter's your miracle baby. Why do you call her that?
Well, she's an only child, and she should never have, I suppose, come into existence. So the topic we're going to be talking about is fertility. And my wife and I were told by many specialists in the fertility field that we would never have children. So our daughter is absolutely, best way to describe it is a miracle baby. She should never have come into existence. So we had some fertility issues.
When you say fertility issues, is that something that's come up recently, or do you want to take us right back to the start?
Yeah. So plenty of people go through fertility issues, and some people know beforehand and others find out later. And sometimes I'd say it's with the bull. And sometimes it's with the cow. It's got the fertility issues. And in this case, it's with the bull. That's me. And so I knew for a long, long time that having children was going to be impossible due to, I think the best way to put it is medical negligence when I was a child. Not enough time to go into that today, but essentially I was told you would never have children. And as I said, my wife knew that, and we went into that process. And so when my wife and I had that conversation, she accepted it, which was quite interesting. So if we go back to the start, when my wife and I first met, I believed that I couldn't have children. And so that was a conversation we had to have early in the relationship. And in her credit, she said, fine. She said, I want children, but I'll accept that. And we moved on. But once we got married and got along in life and, we talked about kids, and I love kids. Like, I'm very, very fun Uncle Benny to all my nieces and nephews. And I love dealing with kids and I love helping kids. And a lot of the reasons I was successful in financial advice is when I'd work with families, it wasn't just with them, it was with their kids to prepare them to take over. And my wife said to me, Ali, she said one day she popped up, and she's an introvert, so she's the exact opposite personality to me. She's an engineer by trade, far, far smarter than I'll ever be. And she came in, she goes, look, I know you said it's impossible, and I know the doctor told you it was impossible. She goes, but I don't believe it. And I said, well, love, you're shit out of luck. This is the facts.
This is the reality.
And and then we started a journey, Ali. We went and saw a doctor. He said, look, there's some new technology out there which might allow you to have children. And he said, but it requires some tests. And of course, that's probably the hardest part of the whole process, was to go from it's impossible to, now there's some hope. Maybe there is.
Yeah.
And then we went and had a procedure, did some tests, and the doctor came back and said, look, it's a slim chance, but it's possible. And that's when my wife looked at me and she said, I told you.
I'm just sitting here as you're saying that, and I'm thinking about what it would be like sitting in a doctor's surgery. Because how long had you been told that you couldn't have children for before you got the possibility?
Yeah, I think since I was in my early 20s.
Yeah.
So I'd known. This was when I was roughly 35, I think, Ali. So 15 years.
So 15 years of thinking, absolutely no way, this is not possible. You create your whole future and life around not being able to have children, and now you're sitting in doctor's surgery with the potential possibility that you might.
Yeah. And it was a big mind shift, because I'd thrown all my energy into knowing that, that wasn't a possibility, and not wanting to think about it, and then throwing myself into my career. And we went through the first round of IVF, and if anyone's done IVF, it's not exactly fun. And the doctor essentially came aside and said, you're wasting your money. Give up. I know I told you could, but it's impossible. And you can imagine the flip from you can't, you're never going to, we think you can, to let's give it a go, and no, sorry, you're wasting your time. That was the worst.
Yeah, absolutely. How did you both react to that information? Because I'd imagine it could have even been different between the two of you. Yeah.
Look, my grandfather, who passed away not last year, the year before, at 97, he said to me, you're in strife, young fella. He said, you're pig-headed and your wife is stubborn. And he couldn't have been more true. And I think for me, it was like a complete, why did I waste my bloody time? I was pretty angry about it all. I felt ripped off. Like, I felt like the doctor had just said, yeah, let's give this a go. Because I think it was $7,000 to $10,000. It wasn't like, we'll just go do a blood test and it's done. It was a big thing. And essentially what they did, Ali, for those squeamish people listening, is they had to take a biopsy from me. And so that took me 3 months to recover from.
So when you say a biopsy, I know we're sort of talking around it, but I think we should just name it. Like, do you want to explain what that looks like? Because, some people are going to go through this, and I think it really gives value to kind of the experience.
Absolutely, yeah. So essentially, if anybody from the land or has anything to do with horses will remember, if you've ever seen a needle that they give a horse for penicillin or a bull, take one of those and stab you in the testicles multiple times to take core samples, and then they take that, and that's what they use. So it took, as I said, 3 months to heal and recover from that.
Physically or psychologically?
Physically. No, psychologically it was fine. Physically was the problem. If anyone's been kicked in that area, multiply that by about 100. So, yeah, and I had to go through it in local anaesthetic too. So that was the most traumatic part, was that procedure was just hell. And when my wife talks about what she had to go through, like, we both have a good understanding of how each other and, what women have to go through. So I always say I sort of get what it's like.
Yeah. And also get what it's like on your own, because not many men have gone through that. So, at least as women, we can band together in that labour, and that, there's a camaraderie in that, and there's a whole history of stories around that. But for men, I'd imagine very few men even talk about it if they get it. It's not something you sit around the kitchen table and talk about.
Absolutely not. I mean, the fertility discussion never, ever comes up anywhere, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but absolutely, yeah, it was. And look, my wife essentially said, let's just think about this for a while. She goes, but I don't believe him. And it was only lucky that someone I knew who through work, she had a baby, and she called in one day at the office, and somehow her daughter came up and she said, she's an IVF baby. And short end of the story, they had the same problems as my wife and I had. And she went and saw a doctor she did all the research. She found the best doctor in the whole of Australia in her mind, interviewed, I think it was something like 15 different doctors, found this guy, and he managed to get a result for them. So my wife said, well, we're going to go again.
How was that for you? Like, I'll just pause you for a moment there because you'd been on this big roller coaster. When she said to you, we're going to go again, were you like, yep, strap me in, well, let's go? Or were you like cautious around that because of when you said before that massive drop when you got told that he said, sorry, there's nothing we can do?
Today's episode is brought to you by AgriCoach. You've worked bloody hard over the years and you've built a solid operation. But as your children grow up and start their own journeys, you're beginning to think about the next 5, 10, and even 15 years and how to keep driving the business forward and ensure a smooth and successful succession plan. Preparing the business, preparing the next generation, and preparing for your eventual retirement all requires a solid plan and a proven process. Unsure about the right steps to take? Head on over to agricoach.com.au/webinar to learn more about our Succession Proof Your Family webinar. AgriCoach, aligning families, growing wealth, and protecting legacies. And now, let's get back to the episode. I think we talked about the alternatives, and the alternatives were a motivation to give it another go.
Okay.
You know, I wasn't willing to talk about the other options. That was where I hit a brick wall. I just couldn't get my head around it at that stage. And so I was willing to go and see this doctor. And essentially he sat down and he said, look, he was brutally honest. Like, he was a terrible bedside manner, but he was very good at what he did. And he just looked at us and he said, this is going to be tough. It's going to cost you a lot of money. He says, but if you're patient enough, we'll get a result. And he filled us with confidence. And essentially, in the end, we went through essentially 5 years of IVF and a lot of heartache because we got a lot of no's. Oh, maybe. No, until we finally got a yes.
And when you say you went through 5 years of IVF, a lot of the listeners won't have been through that process. What does the process of IVF look like?
Well, the first thing is the drugs. Like, I was on some pretty hardcore drugs, which the doctor said to me, there's no side effects, but there were. I essentially had to cycle through these really heavy fertility drugs, which effectively, I have to be careful saying this, my wife would kill me, but I essentially had PMS every 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And I was as cranky as a cut snake. I just, not rage, but I had no patience for things.
Were you aware of that at the time?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was obvious. Yeah, it was obvious. I just wake up cranky and I just say, I don't know why I'm cranky, but I'm damn cranky, and I had no patience. And that was for 3 years I had to go through that. That was huge. So it was just every 3 weeks. And then my wife was on similar drugs. She was on drugs which were up and down, and we had to drive to see doctors, and then you'd go through a procedure, and then the doctor would say, yep, how did it go? 2 days later, no, sorry, we didn't get any embryos. It was a complete failure. You need to wait 2 months again, then go again, and you'd write out a check for $10,000 again, and off you go. And I think in the end, we'd spent about $100,000. A lot of that was covered by Medicare. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to, but we outlaid up to $100,000 to do that, and with no guarantee of a result. The other thing was also is we couldn't talk. We didn't want to talk to anyone about it. So nobody knew. It was just my wife and I. I think I let my parents know because they knew that we couldn't have children. So I'd let them know we were doing something, but it was literally just her and I. We kept it really quiet and nobody knew. So it was 5 years of dealing with all these things just for ourselves.
And when you look back now in hindsight, would you do it that way again, or would you? Yeah. And why do you say that?
I think the problem is most people don't understand what it's like going through it. They don't understand. I mean, even people that have gone through IVF themselves and had it compared to us an easy journey don't understand how difficult it was, because we're talking about just continual no's the whole time. Fail, 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 fail. Maybe fail, maybe fail. It's just the conversations, Ali. It's just people asking you, oh, how's it going? What's happening? We just retreated into ourselves and just dealt with it. I wouldn't recommend that for everyone, but for us, that worked.
And were there other things that you used during that time? Because 5 years is a really long time. Like, if we just pause for a moment and consider how long 5 years is of dishing out the cash, having no after no after no, I can't imagine.
Yeah, we're pretty tenacious. And there was plenty of times, Ali, where both of us thought about giving up. We sort of balanced each other up where, I'd go into I'd get fairly upset about things, and Sarah'd say, no, come on, we've got to keep going. And then she'd hit a hole and I'd say, no, come on, we've got to keep going. So we kept each other up, but we did everything. Like, we got fit as hell. We went completely gluten-free, completely dairy-free, no caffeine, virtually no alcohol. And that was a massive change in diet because the doctor told us every little thing counts. And you couldn't tell people. Like, you'd say, oh, look, we're gluten-free now for a reason and we're not drinking at the moment. And people would just look at you and we lost friends over that. Friends that, especially in the guy area, that said, if you're not going to be drinking, we're not going to invite you to go do things. So that became really socially isolating. And that was, even family that would say, you're not drinking anymore at the moment. Well, we're not going to invite you to things. Yeah, it was very, very socially isolating.
And all-consuming as well as the piece that you're missing. Like, you wake up thinking about it. You have breakfast thinking about it. You miss your coffee thinking about it. You go for training thinking about it. You go to bed thinking about it. Do you know what I mean? Like, 5 years of all-consuming thought process around, is this going to be the time that it works, or can we do another month of this?
Yes and no. It's funny. It peaked and troughed, I think, because what happens is you'd get this, righto, we've got to prep for this. So we're taking the drugs and Sarah had to have injections and, we're trying to keep everything perfect. And then you get a no. And then it was really lucky. We had the business. We started the business. So everything went into the business instead. So that was our distraction. And so our whole life revolved around making our business the best we could possibly make it. And in hindsight, that's probably a major reason why it became so good in the end, is because that's where all our energy went.
And tell us about the moment when you found out that she was pregnant.
Well, it was pretty weird actually, because out of the whole 5 years, we got 3 embryos. So to put it into context for people that don't know, my understanding is generally someone will go through IVF, they'll collect some eggs, they'll fertilise them and they'll get 7 or 8 eggs or 2 or 3 eggs. That's the sort of success story. Well, we do and get none. And so we went through 5 years and we got 3 embryos the whole time. And the first one was just about rubbish. They said it wasn't that great, the quality. So we put it in, failed. Then we had 2. We finally got 2, which was just an absolute miracle. The doctor said, I can't believe we've got 2. And one wasn't great quality and one was reasonable quality, were his words. And so we threw the great quality one, implanted it, and it didn't stick. And then we froze one and we just left it in the freezer for 6 months. And we just didn't know what to do. I just said, what are we going to do? We need to make sure everything's perfect before this embryo gets implanted. And I don't know what happened, Ali. I don't remember why this happened, but we implanted the embryo, we decided to, the day before we moved house, which is utter madness.
Well, it's because you don't do things in halves, right? It's like, what have we got to lose? We've got to keep trucking,
Absolutely. And what it did was it distracted Sarah. So she was not obsessing over it the whole time, which is because it becomes obsessive.
You're not going to tell us that you missed the pregnancy and then you found out when she was like 12 weeks pregnant.
No, I wish.
Like, if you tell me that, I'm going to fall off the chair.
Yeah, we knew straight away. So yeah, she literally we moved house, we put the embryo in, moved house the next day, and then I think it was 7 or 8 days later we did a test from memory and it said pregnant. We're like, holy dooly. And then everything just from there went perfect. We did get very excited, but we didn't want to get excited because 5 years of yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, all you've got is a little stick with a positive test on it at a week in. I mean, so much can go wrong.
Yeah.
Between then and birth. So we were just the whole time holding our breath more than anything.
It's so, and I don't know, because I have not been in this experience, so it's really hard for me to speak from this space. But when you're telling that story, I'm like, God, I hope it gives some hope to some people out there. But at the same time, I'm aware that sometimes people need to call it, and say that we've done everything we can in this moment and we can't keep going. But I do hope that your story is something that sprinkles a little bit of hope on someone that's in the middle of it right now, really giving everything that they can be giving to this situation and knowing that it is possible.
You do. And it all depends on your personality types too. Like we were pretty dogged about things and we are pretty stubborn. We always say, oh, we're very lucky people. Now, if you hear that story at the end, you think you're lucky, but, you know, for 5 years you thought you were very unlucky.
Yeah.
But, yeah, you do. I mean, we went back and tried for a second one and just got nowhere. Like we just got no. And in the end, the doctor just looked at us and said, you've got one, be grateful. Which we called it at that stage. And, yeah, you do. You have to. I think for me, we just weren't ready to say no. We were very, very close, like right at the end. If that embryo, little Sophie, hadn't have stuck, I don't know if we'd have gone back again. The reason I talk about this is because a couple of people talked to me when I was going through this that had been through IVF. I know I mentioned before that we didn't really talk to anyone, but there was a few occasions where things popped up and I listened, and that gave us a bit of hope. And for men, you know, in society, we have a lot of conversations about women and fertility and how difficult it is, but you never find any discussions about men and the issues they have to go through. And there is no support and there's no conversation about it. And I just want to raise one if we've got time, Ali.
We've got loads of time.
Yeah, which is the reason why I talk about this. I'll just put you into the situation. So my office was in the centre of Brisbane. I had a couple of friends that were professionals in the banking and finance and legal space, and I got invited along to a lunch one day in the centre of Brisbane, and they're all in their suits and ties, and I'm not a suit and tie sort of guy, so I'm in my normal shirt, a pair of jeans and boots. And one of the guys' wives was pregnant, and the whole conversation got around this, and you can imagine these guys have had a few beers, blokey sort of blokes, and hopefully people don't get offended at hearing this. And one of the guys says, oh, yeah, my wife's pregnant. It was, we decided to have a child, and 3 days later she's pregnant. And the other guy goes, I just have to shake it near my wife and she's pregnant.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the other guy, who was my mate, was sitting there. He knew we'd been through the IVF. I'd had that conversation with him over a beer one day, and he almost cried when I told him the procedure we had to go through 7 times. And he sort of cut the conversation and just sort of, oh, guys, not everyone gets to deal with this, and was really funny about it. And I said, no, I want to tell the story. Is it okay if I tell the story? Because I want to tell the story about the procedure I went through. Because for guys, that's the thing. They sort of look at it and don't get it. And I remember I told the story and everyone's crossing their legs and, oh, my God, I can't believe you went through that. And my mate pulled me aside later on and he said, why do you tell people that? This whole fertility thing. And I'm like, what do you mean? And he said, well, as a bloke, don't you keep it private and personal, the fact that you were virtually infertile? And was essentially, in his nicest way he possibly could, was saying, don't you feel like less of a man because you couldn't just, wink at your wife and she's pregnant? And that was a real eye-opener for me at the time, because I knew I'd felt a little over the year, earlier on I felt very self-conscious about it.
Yeah.
But I'd managed to balance out my life and realise that that's not what makes a man a man. But that was the underlying theme of the table. And they all, you could see them, they looked at me that I went through this procedure 7 times we discussed earlier, like, holy dooly, that's tough to do that. But they looked at me with pity, but for that exact reason. So I suppose what I'm getting at, Ali, is I think we need to have more of these conversations publicly, which even this is I talk to people about this, but doing it in a public place is a little different. So I suppose what I'm getting at, without being too deep, is if I can have this conversation and one person hears it and goes, wow, it's okay, I'm not the only one, or can go, the doctor said no, but maybe I should be a little bit more tenacious, well, I've done my job.
And also my jaw's dropping at the fact that and my anger's coming up, because I'm like, you don't choose that. You didn't choose your fertility status. You have no control over that. And to think that someone can indicate that you're less of a man from it, I know that it would happen, but I'm just sitting here and my blood is boiling. I'm just like, this is not okay. It's not okay.
Yeah, and my comment back was, yeah, but I had a daughter. My daughter was there at the time. I think she was about 1 at the time. I said, yeah, but I'm a good husband. I'm loyal. I'm trustworthy. I don't drink much. I don't go out partying with the boys and causing problems. I'm a good provider. All those sorts of things. I said, that's what makes you a good person, not whether you can actually just father children right off the bat. And look, I know there's a lot of guys have gone through this, because I can tell you the IVF doctor, he said when I went in for the procedure, and with this guy in Brisbane, it was under general anaesthetic, thank God, not local. But he said, I do like 7 or 8 of these a week. So it's not like this is and doesn't happen very often. This happens frequently, but nobody talks about it.
So what would you say to someone that's listening right now that is going through it, that is a male in a very similar situation to you? What words or advice would you have for him?
That's a good question, Ali. It all depends where they're at. I mean, if they're going through the IVF or looking at going through the IVF, I'd say be tenacious and do everything you possibly can to get a result. And that means change your lifestyle, find the best of the best of the best. Don't half-ass it, and be tenacious. If someone's been going through it for a long time, is think about what you want out of life. And if it does get to the point where you can't get a result, you have to live with that and you have to find a way to live with it. But with regards to people that are maybe dealing with infertility and just not feeling happy about it, the obvious, Ali, which is, live a good life, be a good person. That's what makes you a man, not what everyone else would potentially portray.
And what would you say to all the boys sitting at the table that don't have fertility concerns? What advice do you have for them?
Lucky them. For me, it's more about, it was one of my mate's brothers, and it's more about them than the rest of society. Like the guys sitting around the table, so be it. Once they know the story, they're a lot more accommodating and they understand. It's just part of society. It's like men behave badly and men say things and do things and become masculine when they do, which is fine. That's just the way it is. But it's what I'm worried about is that poor bugger that would go into a depth of depression or self-harm because they thought that it's their fault. I think that's probably it. It's not their fault. It's just is what it is.
We talk about like choosing how you play the game. Like these are your cards. It's up to you how you play it. Yeah,
I think that's pretty fair. And look, Sarah, my wife, I think she's a unique personality, and I say that lovingly, but we say it a lot. Look, here's the advice I give my nieces and nephews: is I say, choose your partner wisely. Your choice of spouse will make or break you. And I think just in this scenario, if I hadn't have been married to Sarah, I don't know whether I would have ended up with a child.
And the question I have, and this is not about Sarah, I'm saying, what did you need from your partner as you were going through this? Like, what is it that you, as a man sitting here today, needed from your partner as you walked through these really hard times?
Not pity. Pity was the worst ever. My wife probably would have made a good surgeon, we always say, because she's very direct. So definitely not pity. I was never looking for pity. And again, my personality type's a little bit different. All I wanted was an attaboy.
A what?
An attaboy, You're doing well. Yeah, so a pat on the head.
What did you call it? An attaboy?
Attaboy, yeah.
What does that even mean? Where does that even come from?
I don't know where I got that from, Ali. Yeah, attaboy, good boy, give him a pat. So for me, it was just to be able to say, we're on the right path. We've got this as a team. She never, ever made me feel like I was the problem.
And what's been the hardest part coming on today? Because this is not your normal conversations that you have in a podcast. Were you nervous?
I don't know whether nervous is the right word, Ali. Apprehensive might have been.
Yeah.
I was just a little bit concerned about not explaining myself very well, because I spent 20 years doing financial advice and providing, strategic help for families. And so I know that inside out. This is just something I've got to talk about. So I haven't thought through the structure of how to deliver the message. So I was a bit concerned that it might not actually be really that valuable. It's just a story about something I went through.
Yeah, but that's where the value is, Ben. That's, in you being able to step up to plate and have this conversation with me that's a complete stranger to this outside world, where there's going to be someone out there listening to this very conversation, either going through it, thinking about going through it, have just been through it, has a mate going through it, has a brother going through it, that might just pick up one tiny sentence that you said that may make all the difference.
I think so. And look, this is not therapeutic for me at all. I've moved on, so to speak. So there's no scars there as far as I need to talk through this to make, and tell my story to the world to make me feel better. It's definitely not that. It's more along the lines of what you said, which is if one person listens to this and it changes the way they view this, because it's not about what what's the problem, it's the way you view it, then that's a good result. The only other thing is I was a bit nervous because I don't want to scare people off the process, because when I talk about what we went through, it's pretty tough. Like, there was no easy journey with it. But what I can say is the vast majority of people who go through IVF have a much, much simpler outcome.
And also, I guess the conversation to have is, what's it like for you now? Was it worth it?
Oh, without a doubt. Yeah.
Would you do it again?
100 times over.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd do it if it was twice as hard.
Mm-hmm.
Would I change anything? I don't think there's anything I could have changed, because it was just a journey we had to go on. I've got this great little girl that's, she's 6 now, just her first day of year 1 this year. She's amazing, and she's a little bit of me and she's a little bit of a mother. The only regret I have is we couldn't have got 2. So many people said we did IVF, put 2 embryos in and got twins, and we were praying for twins.
Or quadruplets.
Yeah, which would have been awesome. Yeah. But no, I definitely wouldn't. And there's one other thing I want to say too is you've got to be careful of the doctors as well, Ali, when you go through this. This is just something that was really on my mind. Is my doctor had terrible bedside manner. You got to do your research. You got to know who you're dealing with. You got to build your mental resilience. You got to be tough. I mean, the doctor looked at me one day and we got a no, and I said, geez, that's disappointing. And he just looked across the table and he said, well, we are scraping the bottom of the barrel with you, aren't we?
Yeah, when you're in the most darkest, hardest moment of potentially what you've ever been through, and then someone says that, it is like, how do you receive that comment?
Yeah. And I'm not an angry, violent man, but it's the one time in my life I felt like leaning across the table and punching him in the face. That was probably the lowest point I got, was when it went from being a medical problem that we're going to overcome to became personal. And that was the first time it became personal, and that was horrible. And you will run into experiences where people say the wrong thing. They like to be nice and how's it going? And you'll get there, or maybe you just need to try a little bit harder. You'll get people. You just got to fortify your mind, and you got to really work out, how bad do you want this? Like, how bad do you want this result? And I wanted it bad because the doctor told me I couldn't have it.
Yeah.
And ever since I was a little kid, if someone told me I couldn't do something, it was the biggest motivation for me ever.
And Ben, sitting here as someone that hasn't been through it, as I mentioned earlier, there's been a number of things that you've said that I was like, oh God, I've said that, or oh my God, I've said that, And so if we don't know you're going through it, if the people around you don't know you're going through it, or even if they do know, we're probably never going to get it right with what we say either, And so are there things that you found helpful from people in your outside world, or are there things that you could say to me, I'll just next time be aware of, or perhaps say this, or, because so many times in this interview I was like, oh God, I did that.
Of course, yeah. And it's not until you go through it that you realise it's a problem. And I think it's very personal. Some people can react to different things. So for me, if people said, hey, do you want to talk about that? That was really helpful, because then it was almost like the giving permission, because most of the time you don't want to talk about it. That's all you talk about in your relationship. And then someone comes along and says, oh, how's everything going? Have you had kids yet? Oh, we thought they'd be coming along soon. And you say, no, we can't have children. And then it goes quiet. And the other thing is, I remember a friend at university, and her dad had passed away when she was young. And her mother said the worst thing about it was people would avoid her because they didn't want to have a conversation with her because they didn't know what to say. And I'd probably suggest, if you know someone's going through it, don't necessarily avoid them. Give them the space to be able to talk if they want to. And if they don't, let them go, because it is all consuming and it's all you talk about and all you think about. And sometimes it's just good not to even have to talk about it.
Yeah. And some of the things that we've said on previous podcasts in this space is, if you're not sure, sometimes just a text message saying, I'm thinking of you, you don't need to respond to this, can be enough to connect in with someone that's going through something, any kind of adversity, whether they've just lost someone, whether they're trying to have children, whether they're in the middle of chemo, I think we often find ourselves in positions where we don't have the words and we don't know what to say, and be okay with not knowing what to say, but you can own that space. You can still let people know you're there for them.
Without a doubt. And look, it's giving them permission not to reply. So, for example, and I've done this many times afterwards, is I'll say to people, whether it be an email or a text or a voice, I quite often have voicemails, says, hey, we're thinking of you. I just wanted to send the message. You do not need to reply. And for me, that was always a really good thing, because then that gives them permission. Because when you get those things like, oh, I'm thinking, how's it all going? And it's like, oh,
now what do I say to that?
But now what do I say back? Shit, this sucks, And you've got to be happy with that, not no reply required. Then, why didn't Ben reply to me? I know I said no reply required. Yeah, you just got to be comfortable in that space.
And Ben, something I'm aware of that has happened to many, many of my friends is that they are so excited about having the baby and then go through the labour, the baby comes home, and then things get really challenging for a whole number of reasons, whether they get postnatal, whether a baby has reflux, whether a baby's unwell, whether the partners are on different pages about how they want to parent. And what I've seen and experienced from my friends is that it's just this bottoming out process. Like, it is like no one warns them about you can want a baby so much. It doesn't mean coming home is going to be easy. Like, it can be so challenging. Do you have any comments or any experience or in that space or anything that you want to say to the audience, to the listeners?
Yeah. Look, again, there's always people worse off than we are. I think it doesn't matter what happens. Like, my story here is nothing compared to what most people go through in life. This is just my little journey. But yeah, we had a tough gig. We brought Bub home, and it turns out she had a really bad case of silent reflux. So we didn't know what it was for about 3 months. So my wife got mastitis and started losing her milk supply, and Bub didn't sleep for longer than about 20 minutes for months until we finally figured out what it was. And yeah, we had a business that had an industry was going through a massive change. So I was trying to manage the business. We had no family support. We were on our own in the big smoke. And yeah, my wife with mastitis and a child that didn't sleep would scream every 20 to 30 minutes.
Anyone that has had a reflux, I had 3 reflux babies, and it's kind of like what you were saying earlier. If you haven't been through it, it's a complete world you don't know about. But anyone that's listening right now that has a reflux baby's heart will just sink, right? Because it's tough.
Absolutely, especially when you don't know what's wrong. That was the silent reflux was the problem we had to, and we ended up self-diagnosing it and not the doctors. But yeah, and I think, again, at the time, it's very hard to think practically like this, and anyone going through it now will laugh and say that's easy to say. But I just remember we used the same strategy, which is, okay, what are we dealing with? We wanted this, we chose this. What can we do to get the best possible result we can? And that was, we just tried everything. Look, the one thing for Sarah and I is we started going to the gym a lot more. And Sarah, my wife, who doesn't run much, I always laugh and say the most I've ever seen her run was to the mailbox, and she got into CrossFit. And so I decided to join her later on, and doing some hard, heavy exercise was what mentally got us through the reflux period, the first 6 months of childhood. But yeah, it was tough.
And I think what we're hearing there, Ben, is you have a whole, you might not be aware of this, but what I'm hearing is you have a whole toolbox of strategies, and that's your mental toughness that you're talking about. When you say, I need to pull back on my mental toughness, we need to regather, refocus, we need to look at what are we doing here? What's the outcome we're trying to achieve? And then you're pulling out these things and being like, well, let's see if this works, let's see if the fitness works, and let's do some research and see what we might be able to find here. And I think that's really important when people are going through adversity, whatever the adversity is. It's like, let's just take a moment. It's okay to press pause and kind of sit back and think, what's going on here? Because we can be so in it. And this, I know when I had reflux babies, I was so in it, I couldn't see past it. So taking that sort of step out, that bird's eye view, and going, what's the problem here in this point in time that we want to work on? And what are all the possible solutions that we could look at? Like, let's just put them all on the table, and then let's pick one and try it, because it may work for you. It might work for the next person. It might not work this time, but worked last time. But it's like, give yourself permission to find the space, to find the gap, to step back, to elevate your view so you're looking down on it and thinking, what's actually going on here? If you need someone to soundboard with, if you need to pull on your friends or a professional or your parents or whoever it is, but be like, what am I not seeing here? What angle have I not looked at this from? And then start at the beginning. And I think you've used the word a few times throughout this podcast, refocus, like, what are we going to do next? Now with that information, what's our next step, and what are we going to try, and how are we going to know if that's successful or not?
And we used to trick our mind a little bit too, Ali. We used to have a catchphrase, we're lucky. And so we'd always say, look, what's the best strategy? And say, remember, we're lucky. This is going to work out. And that was the attitude we always had. And I'm not saying we always believed it, but we said it. Yeah. And the second thing, which works for me, and it may not work for anyone else, is I have a propensity to get caught up in your own problems. And they are big to you at the time. But when you take that perspective and think, well, if someone in a third world country and I'm talking about, my child's back chatting me or my child's got reflux, well, at least my child's eating. She's not, starving to death or something like that. And that was super helpful for me. It reframed things all the time.
Yeah, and I think, you did touch on this in the podcast, and I've certainly touched on it in other episodes, is it's not necessarily don't feel it. Like you can feel it, but then you need a strategy. Once you feel it, once you accept where you're at, once you're like, I'm feeling pretty crappy at the moment about this situation. I mean, it's all right. Now we go into that reframe, or now we go into the attitude of gratitude, or now we put in a strategy. And so you don't have to just dismiss everything. You don't have to compress everything. You can feel it. You can acknowledge it. You can absolutely be like, this situation is really shit. Now let's kick into what are we going to do about it? So let's have a look at that picture, or let's have that mind shift, or let's go to and see a doctor, whatever it is.
And I think it's, again, that perspective. Is it really as big a problem as you think it is? And again, in the strategic coaching side of things, is we'll sit down with families around, say, succession, and they'll think, oh my God, this is just undoable. We're never going to be able to achieve this. This is just amazing. And then they sit down with someone for 5 minutes, have a conversation, and the other person looks at them and goes, look, you've got problems for sure, but you can surmount all those. They're just problems that you've got to work through. And they sit back and go, oh, so the problems aren't as big as I thought.
Yeah. And Ben, it's probably a good time to have this conversation, which is exactly why I have it at the end of the podcast, because we do, by the time we finish these stories, and, even I'm feeling a little like, like it's a big story that you've told us here today. I know you've potentially minimized it a little bit, Ben, by saying, but it is huge, right? Like, I just want to acknowledge that space, because not only did you go through it alone, you weren't able to talk about it. It took up a huge chunk of your life. You didn't know you were going to get the outcome that you were going to get. It put a strain on the relationship. You had a business. Like, I could sit here and absolutely tell you why what you went through was massive. But for the audience, what we do is we always ask a question at the end of the podcast so that we can all together lift ourselves and feel a little lighter and get into our adult brains again and hop out of that emotional space. So my question to you, Ben, is who or what in your world truly makes you belly laugh? Belly laugh, like hear you all the way down the hall belly laughing.
So you're probably going to guess, but my daughter, she makes me laugh all the time. We always laugh. She's got my smart mouth and her mother's intelligence. So we're raising an evil genius, but she makes me laugh all the time. And it's not what you'd think. What makes me laugh with my daughter is her brain thinks so differently to most people's. She came in when she was 5 and she said to me, Dad, I've been thinking a lot today. And I said, what have you been thinking about? And you know what 5-year-olds think about. She said, Dad, you know how magma comes out of a volcano as lava? And I said, yes, sweetheart. She goes, what happens if the earth runs out of magma?
Yeah.
And things like that. So she's always coming up with those little things like, how cold is in space, Dad? And is that colder than the refrigerator?
Yeah. It's that philosophical kind of questioning, isn't it? When they come up with it and you just think, whoa, what is going on in that brain of yours?
Without a doubt. She comes up with it all the time, things like that. And I think it's a combination of her being an only child. So she's exposed a lot more to the adult world, which has its pros and cons. But she also sits in on a lot of business conversations. So she hears us talking about, the business and the podcast, and she's inquisitive about stuff. And, just one last one. She came in one day and she goes, Dad, I'm going to start a business and it's making jetpacks. Like, jetpacks, you just strap them to your back and I can fly like a unicorn. I said, that's fantastic. I said, you're gonna make one for me? She goes, oh, Dad, I'll sell it to you at cost and I won't make a profit, but I'm not giving it to you for free.
Well, this got a little entrepreneur right there in your hands for sure.
And it always makes me laugh. And she looks at me, she goes, why are you laughing at me? I said, I'm not laughing at you, love. I'm laughing with you. I said, this is so much fun. And I think I'm laughing in a way of saying, if we hadn't have, just went through hell and back and been or my wife hadn't been as tenacious as she was, because she was the most tenacious, we would have never had this little creature on the earth. So, that's what makes me laugh.
Oh, thank you so much, Ben, for coming on and finding the time. I've really enjoyed sitting here and talking to you this afternoon. It's definitely opened my eyes up. I've never had a conversation, I can't think of ever, with a man about fertility. And I'm someone that asks all the challenging questions and, does all the probing. So the fact that this is the first time I'm having that conversation really scares me.
Well, it's not a conversation you hear very often, Ali. I have to say that. I can't say I've ever sat down with anyone that's been through what I've been through to be able to have a comparative story.
So thank you. Thank you for being so open, so raw, so honest, and just so real.
My pleasure. Absolute pleasure. And as I said before, multiple times, if it helps one person, it's been well worth the investment.
What a conversation.
Phew, well, I'm glad that's over. Now, I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to Ali for encouraging me to publicly share my journey. There was more than one time that I thought about chickening out. Now, if you could do me a favour, share the episode. You never know if someone you know might be going through a similar journey, and hearing this episode might give them the comfort knowing they're not alone and that there are other people who have successfully trodden the path before them. So that's it for today. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you everyone for listening and taking the time out of your day. I believe we can learn so much from connecting with other people's experiences and stories. I hope you've gained some strategies and insight from today's episode. You can gain more by joining our Facebook group, Challenges That Change Us, or next week we will return with another episode.